Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Let me begin by explaining the scaling back. It is not scaling back by the government of Lesotho. It is scaling back by WFP from the support that they were giving us. Oh, okay. Right. Now, how did we cope? How did we cope with the scaling back, and what were the implications and the lessons that we learned? From 1965, WFP began supporting school feeding in all primary schools in Lesotho. And from 1990, that is when this scaling back that we're talking about began. This was the operations and the direct support of WFP in feeding in our primary schools. And what we then had to do to prepare for this phasing out was to experiment with different ways of feeding. One of them was the introduction of self-reliance projects, which began in 1990 and unfortunately fiddled out in 1999. We'll get opportunities to talk about what the challenges are, not now. The second was having what we call caterers. These were women and men around schools who were hired by government and paid by government to provide meals on a daily basis to schools. And this also stopped in 2021. And it stopped because we then undertook a consultancy which looked at all of these methods that we've been using to say, what do we think will be the best method to utilize in school feeding? And we came up with the National Management Agency model, where it is totally outsourced. We have companies that are hired by government to manage and carry out the school feeding program. And this has been operating in all our primary schools since 2022, which is this year. Other activities that we undertook to manage the scaling back by WFP was to formulate the National School Feeding Policy, which we did in 2014. We also piloted this NMA, I'll call it NMA, National Management Agent model, in 2017 to 2019. And so that's what's operating now in all of our public primary schools. The challenges in coping with the scaling back by WFP were humongous. And they came from the fact that our mountain kingdom, as we call it, is mountainous. It has very remote, hard-to-reach schools. And WFP have been doing a stellar job there, so we thought we could just go in and do it. We found out that no, it wasn't that easy. And the people and schools in those areas were unhappy that WFP had left government to take it over, because some of the results of government taking over, this was in 2020, the results of government taking over in these areas was that there were changes in the quantity served, changes downward. The quality of the food supplies was declared not as good, and there was also a decrease in the amounts of money that were paid to the cooks. A lesson that we learned is that the NMA model should have been introduced in phases so that we could look at all the problems that were coming and then solve them. But now we are sitting stuck with them. Considerations that should have been made also in phasing out of the WFP support should not only have focused on the financial capacity of government to finance school feeding. They should also have looked at the implementation capacity. So WFP was quite comfortable with the government that, yes, we'll be able to pay for school feeding, but implementing it seems to be a different story. Now, the last part that I want to share with you is the areas of capacity gaps that we noted after WFP left. The main one, when you start phasing out yourselves, is monitoring. The monitoring capacity of WFP is something else. And government, as government, we are not able to cope with that. There's weak multi-sectoral cooperation. When we're talking about UN agencies, they're able to bring various ministries together. When we now have to do it ourselves, the Ministry of Education calling the Ministry of Agriculture to a meeting, that takes a lot. So finishing off, finishing off, I just want to give us a warning that the final leg of the handover by WFP took place in 2020, and it happened in a very abrupt, unplanned manner. And it affected the remote mountain schools very badly. Our greatest challenge in feeding is in those very schools. Therefore, proper planning for either handover or takeover, because it could have been takeover, you don't know, was absolutely essential. This planning did not happen in our schools in 2020, and this is something that should be avoided at all costs. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
What I know now that I wish I knew when I started working in school feeding is that school feeding is a safety net program, and the school feeding policy, therefore, should not be a ministerial policy, but should be a national policy. This will allow and facilitate multi-sectoral planning, budgeting, and implementation to protect the school feeding program from intermittent budgetary cuts. And these adversely affect implementation and remove the school feeding from being a safety net program for the needy. Multi-sectoral planning will also support the homegrown aspect by improving community ownership and empowerment in producing food and other services for school feeding, leading to improved community livelihoods. Thank you.